There are few greater sins than the dishonest exploitation of someone else's tragedy. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie. You know, having someone exploit the tragedy of another is a sin in and of itself. Having them dishonestly exploit the tragedy of another, that is a sin of the next level. Now, there has been an update in the cause of death of Officer Brian Sicknick, and for those of you who do not know, Officer Brian Sicknick was a Capitol Hill police officer who died the day after the January 6 riots on Capitol Hill. The other day, Officer Sicknick's cause of death was definitively determined to be natural causes by virtue of having suffered 2 strokes the day of the riot, and he passed away the following day. Now, Officer Sicknick's untimely passing is a tragedy. There is no way around it, but there is a world of difference between the tragedy of dying prematurely from a stroke and the way the New York Times exploited his death. He dreamed of being a police officer, then was killed by a pro-Trump mob. The death of Brian Sicknick, a military veteran and experienced Capitol Police officer, amplified the tragedy of Wednesday's riots and undermined President Trump's pro-law enforcement claims. Now, some of you out there who might still be inclined to give the New York Times any shred of the benefit of the doubt might be saying to yourselves, well, they were just reporting on the news as they had it at the time. No. From a February 15th article in the National Review, the Times corrects the record on Officer Sicknick's death, sort of. Yet, as early as the morning of January 8, KHOU in Houston reported that Sicknick had died from a stroke. The KHOU story made no mention of the officers being struck by a fire extinguisher. It did claim, however, that the stroke occurred, quote, at the Capitol during riots, end quote, and a caption under the officer's photograph stated that he died, quote, of injuries sustained during the riot at the Capitol, end quote. The headline of the KHOU story attributes the conclusion that a stroke was the cause of death to the head of the Capitol Police Union, Gus Papathanasiou. The New York Times then went on to publish an article a short while later with something of a more attenuated headline. Capitol Police officer dies from injuries in pro-Trump rampage. The death of the officer Brian D. Sicknick appeared likely to lead to calls for profound changes to the Capitol Police, a centuries-old force. And then the other day, the Times was finally forced to report the following. Officer attacked in Capitol riot died of strokes, medical examiner rules. The determination is likely to complicate efforts to prosecute anyone in the death of the officer Brian Sicknick. The New York Times knew, or ought to have known, as early as January 8th that there were serious problems with the story as they were reporting it. They knew or ought to have known, but they were just so eager to exploit this for political purposes that they just couldn't help themselves. They wanted this tragedy, they needed this tragedy, even if this wasn't actually the tragedy, because they wanted to use it for political fodder to go after Donald Trump, and they weren't alone. From the YouTube channel of Senator Durbin, February 3rd, 2021.
The same terrorist mob that took Brian Sicknick's life stormed past everyone who stood in their path. And for anyone who makes the argument that when it comes to January 6th, it's time for America to get over it, I'm remember one Capitol Police officer who gave his life to protect me and this Capitol.
The media, politicians, they wanted this tragedy, they needed this tragedy because they wanted to use it against Donald Trump in the second impeachment, and they went ahead to exploit the memory of Brian Sicknick in order to do so. And over 3 months later, once all the damage is done, once the media and politicians have exploited Officer Sicknick's death for all the purposes they wanted to, the truth comes out, and the truth is that the media are liars. And yes, I am using the term liars because the New York Times knew that the story they were running at the time was bunk, or they knew shortly thereafter that it was bunk, and they never corrected it, and they probably will never do a proper retraction and correction. U.S. Capitol Police officer who was hurt during Jan 6 siege died of natural causes, medical examiner. Office rules Brian Sicknick died of a stroke, meaning it is less likely anyone will be charged with his death. Yes, when someone dies of natural causes, as tragic as that may be, it does make it kind of hard to charge someone for the death of someone who died from natural causes. And notice the framing right there in the headline. The officer who was hurt in the January 6 siege died of natural causes. Yes, apparently he was hurt during the siege because he was pepper sprayed with bear mace from 1.5 meters to 2.5 meters away. But look at the way they still have to tie the death to the siege itself. And some people out there might think that they're using somewhat politically inflammatory rhetoric by referring to the January 6 riots as a siege, but that is a separate issue. It is all about framing. It is about framing in the normal run of things. It's especially about framing when you basically have to admit that all of the original stories were absolutely false. U.S. Capitol Police officer Brian Sicknick, who was injured while confronting rioters during the Jan 6 raid on the Capitol, suffered a stroke and died from natural causes, the Washington, D.C. Medical Examiner's Office ruled Monday, a finding that lessens the chances that anyone will be charged in his death. Investigators initially believed the officer was hit in the head with a fire extinguisher based on statements collected early in the investigation, according to two people familiar with the case. And they later thought the 42-year-old Sicknick may have ingested a chemical substance, possibly bear spray, that may have contributed to his death. But the determination of a natural cause of death means the medical examiner found that a medical condition alone caused his death. It was not brought on by an injury. The determination is likely to significantly inhibit the ability of federal prosecutors to bring homicide charges in Sicknick's death. Yeah, it should greatly inhibit the ability to bring homicide charges in his death because his death was not ruled a homicide. Now, this question actually came up in the Derek Chauvin trial because George Floyd's cause of death was determined to be homicide. Now, homicide on a death certificate is not a legal determination. It simply means that another human contributed to the death, hence homicide. It is now known that Brian Sicknick's sole cause of death was natural causes, hence natural causes on the death certificate. So of course it's going to be difficult to bring homicide charges because homicide was not his cause of death. Even when the entire narrative comes apart at the seams, you have fake news trying to stitch it together to preserve the original narrative. Fake news trying to preserve the original narrative and continue to exploit the death of Brian Sicknick. Federal prosecutors have charged two men with using bear spray on Sicknick during the Jan 6 riot. The arrests of George Tanios, 39, of Morgantown, West Virginia, and Julian Cater, 32, of Pennsylvania, were the closest federal prosecutors have come to identifying and charging anyone associated with the 5 deaths that happened during and after the riot. If these two individuals actually used pepper spray or bear spray on Officer Sicknick or any other officer, they should absolutely be held accountable for their actions. But you see even in this paragraph how they are trying to spin Officer Sicknick's death for political purposes. And it's not just with Officer Sicknick's death. The 5 other people who died during or after the riots, apparently all but one of them died from medical emergencies, and the only one who was actually killed by an officer on scene,
nobody is standing trial for that.
The truly shocking thing about all of this is that if you dared question this story from the beginning, you were called a conspiracy theorist, but lo and behold, the entire story we were being sold from the beginning was absolute bunk. And worse than being absolute bunk, it actually exploited the death of an individual for political purposes, and that is enough to enrage anybody. So that is the update, and I don't expect a correction or a retraction from the New York Times anytime soon. I tweeted out as much to them, and I don't expect to get a response. Viva Frei at the Viva Frei is at New York Times going to retract and correct this article.
Nope.
That is the update. I doubt very much that the New York Times is going to amplify the fact that they outright exploited the death of Brian Sicknick, but I think everybody out there, or as many people as possible, need to know the truth. So that is the video for today. If you like my video and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
Feed me all night long.
If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube membership. We've got merch, Anti-Media. Robert Barnes and I do weekly live streams every Sunday. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. We also have a page on Locals.
VivaFrei.locals.com.
And all of my content is also on Rumble. But more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Peace out. Booyah!